Who took me up on the Lenten challenge this week? Who did something, served in some way you never have before? I know some of you did. I did. Who worked in the potato booth for the first time this week for the church? Okay, so that's it. Or in the strawberry shortcake booth. If you worked in one of those booths, you and I served in a way we never have before. One year I met the Lenten challenge by taking a mattress, one that we'd never slept on before, and giving it away to someone in the community. Another year I fasted at lunch every Monday and spent that time focusing on God, thinking and praying. There are so many different ways that we can do things during this Lenten season, so many different things. I read about a creative way a Houston family served. A young mother with two girls, they were 5 and 7 years old. They did something they'd never done before. It wasn't for Lent, but it was so good, I wanted to use it and offer it to you. It might give you some inspiration. Since both girls have birthdays in January, they've typically had a combined birthday party. So this young mother decided to help them add a new dimension to their party. She helped them plan a service-oriented party on a Friday evening at the Houston Food Bank. Then they sent out invitations to their friends and their family. A lot of people showed up for the party. They had a great time working side by side, sorting out all sorts of things: household goods, school supplies, toys, and food. Kids as young as 4, adults as old as 70 got involved. They kept at it for 2 hours and had a great time. Then the party moved to another room. It was filled with balloons and cupcakes, and everyone sang happy birthday to the 2 little girls, who, according to their mother, loved the evening and were filled with the joy of serving others. Serving others really does give people joy, right? Anyone who serves someone else knows that. And serving others is what Jonah was supposed to do. He was a prophet directed by God to go to the people of Nineveh. But he didn't go. He took off running in the opposite direction. Got on a ship headed much, much further in the opposite direction. God, however, wasn't going to let him off the hook. So he stirred up a storm with winds and waves so violent that they threatened to break the ship apart. The sailors were terrified. They rowed and rowed. They prayed. They threw cargo overboard, but nothing seemed to help. They were completely powerless against this storm. Eventually, exhausted and out of ideas, they did what Jonah asked. They threw him overboard. And suddenly, everything became calm, and the ship sailed off into the sunset while Jonah sank deep beneath the waters in its wake. And this is where we'll pick up the story this morning, with Jonah sinking deeper and deeper into the sea. I invite you to stand as you're able and follow along as I read Jonah chapter 1, verses 17 through chapter 2, verse 10. But the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land. This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. After being thrown overboard, Jonah sank like a rock into the depths of the sea. But he did not drown. Why? Because the Lord saved him. God sent a large fish to swallow him up. Jonah was in the belly of that fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And then, the Bible tells us, then Jonah prayed to the Lord. Do you realize that was the first time he prayed in the whole story? When God sent him to Nineveh, he didn't pray. He didn't argue, Lord, I don't want to go. I don't like those people. They're evil. You need to send somebody else. And he didn't question God. Isn't there someone else you can send? Isn't there somewhere else you can send me? I don't like the sound of this assignment. There's got to be something else I can do for you, Lord. Jonah didn't argue or question God. He didn't communicate with God in any way. He didn't pray. He just took off running the other way. Remember when the storm hit the ship? Jonah didn't pray. Everybody else did, but not Jonah. Even after the ship's captain woke him up, told him what was going on, that the ship was about to break apart, even when the ship's captain asked him to pray, Jonah did not pray. And later, when all the sailors prayed again, just before throwing Jonah overboard, he did not pray. Jonah didn't pray when he splashed down into the stormy waters. He didn't pray as he sank deeper and deeper into the sea. He didn't pray when he knew he was about to drown. Jonah didn't pray when that large fish came along to swallow him up. He didn't pray during his first day and first night inside the fish. He didn't pray during his second day and second night inside the fish. Jonah didn't pray until he'd been inside that fish for 3 days and 3 nights. That's what we read. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. What took so long? Why didn't Jonah pray sooner? You think a prophet would pray when he was in trouble? You think a prophet would pray when he was about to die? But not Jonah. He didn't pray because, as we already know, he was running from God. He knew he was doing wrong, and he was so stubborn, so determined to do what he wanted to do, he would rather die than talk to God. But Jonah didn't die. He didn't get his way that time either, did he? God made sure of it by sending him a fish. Now, I haven't ever been inside a fish before. I hope that doesn't surprise anybody here, but I haven't. I have no desire to be inside a fish, but I can imagine what it's like. I imagine it's real dark, wet, smelly, and not a whole lot of room. I imagine Jonah was in a real tight spot. I imagine him being so cramped up inside that fish that he would have felt a lot like a baby in his mother's womb, completely surrounded by flesh and fluid, without room to stretch or move or do much of anything. And with 3 days and 3 nights in that real tight spot, with nowhere to run, nothing to distract him, nothing else to do, Jonah had a lot of time to think. And he did. He thought a lot. He thought about the decisions he'd been making. He thought about the trouble that he brought on himself, every member of that ship's crew, the captain, and other people. He thought about the fact that he was still alive. He should have been dead. There's no doubt about it. He should have drowned. But he was alive. And he knew he was still living and breathing by the grace of God alone. So Jonah finally came to his senses and turned back to God. And for the first time in this story, he prayed. He thanked God for saving him from certain death, and he recommitted his life to the Lord. Then all of a sudden, that large fish vomited. And by God's grace, Jonah was delivered from death to life when he landed on that beach. He was born again, given a new birth, a new start, as he set out to serve the Lord again. It's amazing to me how much Jonah went through, how much he had to go through. It's amazing to me how much many of us will go through before we finally come to our senses. So many people don't want to stop and think about where their lives are headed. They certainly don't want to seek direction from God until they find themselves in a real tight spot. Why is that? Maybe it's part of our brokenness. Maybe it's why God is so patient with us. But it sure would be easier on us and so much better if we never ran from God in the first place. Of course, there are people who find themselves in a real tight spot who haven't been running from God. Some people after a heart attack or some major health problem find themselves in a tight spot. They wake up in a hospital bed, hooked up to all sorts of machines and IVs, suddenly faced with their own mortality. And they begin to think. They begin to reevaluate life. Karen and I went through that when she was diagnosed with cancer, and it changed us. We began to think about this precious gift of life in ways we never had before. About how powerless we are. That life's completely and totally a gift from God. Some people find themselves in a real tight spot after a divorce. The relationship they thought was going to last a lifetime is over. They feel like a failure. They feel ashamed. They may feel betrayed. And as they lay awake in bed at night, all alone, they think and pray and reevaluate life. Some people find themselves in a real tight spot when they lose their job. The bills are still coming in. They still need to put food on the table, still need clothing, transportation, a place to live. But they don't have any income and don't know when they will. So they think and pray and reevaluate life. Some people find themselves in a real tight spot when they have a run-in with the law. So as they sit alone in their jail or prison cell, they begin to think. They have lots of time to think and pray and reevaluate life. Some people find themselves in a tight spot after the death of a loved one. Some find themselves in a tight spot as they go through a midlife crisis or when they experience a natural disaster, a war, or some other major life event. I imagine the coronavirus has caused many people to feel like they're in a real tight spot. All those people on the cruise ships in those inner cabins for weeks on end. People who need to find child care for their children this week because they're going to be out of school. Maybe not here, but in other places. And so many others. A few years ago, a friend of mine named Tim found himself in a real tight spot. He told me about it. Tim had a good job. Things were going really well at work. He was dedicated. He worked hard. He was moving up. And he liked it. So he kept working hard. He worked long days, real long days, week in and week out. Eventually, all of those long days began to take their toll on him. He was exhausted. And late one evening, as he was driving home from work from Lake Charles, something happened. He was headed west toward Texas. He was driving over a large overpass where the 210 loop merges into the I-10 westbound lanes. But that night, Tim didn't make it over the overpass. He fell asleep. He drifted out of the lane. He hit the guardrail. His car flipped up and over the guardrail, came to rest 40 or 50 feet below on its top in the eastbound lanes of I-10. Tim's car was a twisted mess of metal, rubber, and plastic. The top was completely crushed in, so was the driver's seat. It looked really bad when the emergency responders arrived. But Tim was not in the driver's seat. Somehow his body had been thrust forward and down toward the passenger side floorboard. As Tim lay there in the vehicle that night, he was in a real tight spot. He could not move. And he realized right away that it was by the grace of God alone that he was alive. The emergency responders were absolutely amazed to find him alive. After 2 hours, when they were finally able to cut him free from the wreckage, it was miraculous that his only injuries were a few cuts and scrapes and bruises. Tim said that traumatic experience helped him look at life in a completely new way. And he wasn't just talking about from upside down in his car in the middle of a highway. He doesn't recommend doing it that way. But Tim began to reevaluate. He began to look at everything in his life in a new way. And he stopped running. He started thinking about the decisions he'd been making. And he started praying. And the things that were truly important began to take priority in his life. Tim decided to work fewer hours, to spend more time with his family. He got his kids involved with scouts. He started going to their games and their school activities. And his whole family became much more involved with the church. I had the honor of baptizing Tim and all of his children. I don't know how many of you caught it when I was telling this story, but there's some powerful symbolism in Tim's story. He had his wreck. He got into that real tight spot when he was headed to the west, just like Jonah running from Nineveh. And after flipping over the guardrail and falling, kind of like Jonah fell into the waters when he was tossed out of the ship, Tim dropped down into the eastbound lanes. Tim turned around in every way that night. So our God of grace gave him a new start. He was born again as he began making a real effort to live a life more pleasing to God. Could you live a life more pleasing to God? Could you spend more time thinking about life and praying? I think you could. We all could. So let me encourage you as we continue through this Lenten season together to find a way to shut out all distractions so you can listen closely to God. If you do, I promise, only because he's already promised, you will hear from him. And if you follow the direction he gives you, the things that truly are important will become greater priorities in your life. So you'll be living a life more pleasing to God, and by his grace, you'll be living a life more pleasing to you as well. Listen now to this beautiful song about God's grace.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I found. Was blind, but now I see. His grace.